We would like to move swiftly on to the lunch program, and so to that end, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee and United Kingdom's former Foreign Secretary. David.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be back in London. I've just had 2 days in Germany, in Munich, and I'm looking forward to talking about the new Europe. And when I look at the lead, follow, or step aside, it's not too difficult to know who is stepping aside, I'm sorry to say. And we're going to have a good chance to talk about Brexit and the way the new Europe is being built. Living and working in New York now, I am actually more optimistic about continental Europe than I've been for about 10 years. But before I do that, I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes about my day job, and then we'll have about 20 minutes with Adam Boulton for him to talk to me about some of the themes that you've been discussing today. And to start my description of the work I do with the International Rescue Committee, I don't want to start with new Europe, I want to start with old Europe. Well, let's see if the slide comes up. I'll get out of your way. These two handsome gents, on the left-hand side is my dad, and on the right-hand side is my grandfather, Ralph and Samuel. That's Clapham High Street in 1940. They were Jewish refugees from Belgium, and they left Belgium the day that the Nazis invaded. And then there's this group of school children, school-aged children, who arrived in the UK in 1946. And in the middle is my mother, Marion. She was a refugee from Poland after having been hidden during the war in Poland and survived the war. And it's partly that history that drew me to work for these people. These are Rohingya Muslims. They're people who've been driven from their homes in Myanmar, in Burma. And I now run an organization called the International Rescue Committee, which was founded by Albert Einstein in 1933 in New York to rescue Jews from Europe. Today, we're a global humanitarian charity with offices in 196 field sites in 30 war-torn countries. Countries that are in the war, we've got 1,000 employees in Syria. Countries that are hosting refugees, the neighboring states, countries like Jordan and Lebanon, Kenya and Ethiopia. Refugee transit routes, we have a team of 130 inside Libya. And then finally, for the lucky refugees who make it to the West, we run refugee resettlement services around the US in 26 US cities, or we do at the moment, and until President Trump manages to strangle the program completely, which is something I'm going to come back to today. And what I want to just do is talk a bit about the global refugee crisis, what it is, then talk about the resolution of that crisis, because the truth is that the biggest enemy we face is that deadening sense that there are no solutions to the refugee crisis, that it can't be managed. And then I want to finish up by saying a bit about why I think the treatment of refugees, the way in which refugees and displaced people are handled, is a bellwether for the fate of the global system, for whether or not we can manage a global commons, which is more interdependent in a more connected world, and I hope to do so in a way that dramatizes the scale of the challenge we face. 1 in every 110 people on the planet has been displaced from their homes by conflict or persecution, like these Rohingya Muslims. That's 65 million people in total. About 25 million are refugees. That means they've crossed the border from one state to another. The remaining 40 million are what's called internally displaced people. That means that they've remained inside their own country. So in Syria, to take that as an example, there's about 5.5 million refugees who fled into the neighboring states. There's 7.5 million people inside the country. But what I want to explain to you is that the crisis is not just born of the scale, the number of people who've been displaced by war and persecution. There are 3 other things that are important. This young man is Frederick. He's from Burundi, and I met him in Tanzania, where he'd fled. It was the second time he'd been driven out by the Burundian civil war. And the interesting thing about him is that he, like half of all the world's refugees and displaced people, is under the age of 18. So half of refugees and displaced people are kids. So the second thing that I just want to bring out, this is Halud. She was born to Palestinian refugee parents who lived, ironically, outside Damascus in Syria. When the Syria war kicked off, she became a refugee herself, and she now lives in a town in northern Lebanon, and she actually works for the International Rescue Committee. The point I want you to remember about her is that she's an urban refugee. She lives in a town, and she needs the income from the work that she does for us to pay her rent. She, along with 60% of the world's refugees, don't live in refugee camps. They live in urban areas. And the third and most tragic thing that I want you to remember about this crisis, this is a woman called Silo. When I met her, she was living in Dadaab, the world's largest refugee camp in eastern Kenya. It was home to about 300,000 people. She had 3 kids. You can't see them in this picture. One of them had an old T-shirt and it said Obama on it. It's not a bad definition of globalization. And I said to Silo, with all the naivety of someone who comes from the West, I said, "Do you think you'll ever go back to Somalia?" And she looked at me and she said, "What do you mean go back to Somalia? I was born here, in this refugee camp." And then when I asked the camp management how many people of the 300,000 had been born in that camp, they gave me the answer: 100,000 had been born there. So the average length of displacement for a refugee is 10 years. And once you've been a refugee for 5 years, it's a 21-year fate that faces you. That means that we have to think in radically new ways about what refugees need. And I just want to mention 4 things very briefly. If you're displaced for an average of 10 years, then it's obvious that refugees need to be able to work. This is a family actually in Uganda, which is a country that does allow refugees to work. They've just received 1 million refugees from South Sudan in the last year in Uganda. If refugees are going to be allowed to work in countries like Jordan and Lebanon, in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, then they need a radically different package of economic support from the international system. Because for them, they've got unemployment among their own host populations. So we have to rethink the way we offer support to fragile states like Jordan and Lebanon, like Kenya and Ethiopia. Second obvious thing, if half of all the world's refugees are kids, then education becomes really important. But if you look, what's the proportion of the global humanitarian budget that's spent on education? It's 2%. That's just not just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. There are 250,000 Syrian kids in Lebanon who've never had any education for the last 6 years. And I would say that's not just a big global problem, it's actually a massive global scandal. And next Monday in Chicago, I'll be pitching to the MacArthur board to win the $100 million prize that they have offered to solve a big global problem. And we're going to dedicate that $100 million if we win it. We're down to the last 4. There were 1,900 applicants for the MacArthur Prize. We're down to the last 4. If we win, we're going to dedicate that to tackling toxic stress, that's brain trauma, effectively, among under 8-year-olds in the Middle East, so that we can get them ready to learn. Third thing that families like this need, it's obvious, really. What do refugees and displaced people lack more than anything else? They lack cash. Yet, at the moment, less than 6% of the global humanitarian budget goes on cash payments. It's built around giving people tents and food, whereas actually it'd be far more sensible to give them cash. We did a study in Lebanon. If you give a refugee $100, $213 circulates in the local economy. So you've got a win for the local host population, and you've got a win for the refugees. And the fourth thing that we have to defend is the following: refugee resettlement into Western countries. The US has traditionally taken about 90,000 refugees a year. President Trump has reduced that down to 45,000 maximum. Our latest study shows that there'll be only about 15,000 refugees who are allowed in. UK, only about 4,000 or 5,000 refugees allowed in every year. And the reason that's important is not just the substantive value that it offers to those who do get the chance of resettlement, it's also the symbolic stand that Western countries take when they take in refugees with countries that are hosting them. Countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, like Lebanon and Jordan. So my argument is that those that 4-part policy agenda, if deployed properly, would make this refugee crisis manageable rather than insoluble. And I've tried to talk about this in a new book that I've written that's available from all good bookshops. I'm Learned in America that if you're shy, then you can't get anywhere. So an audience of 300 or 400 people, you've got to be willing. I've learned something else as well. Because I'm British, I don't like talking about money, but having lived in New York for 4 years, it comes naturally now to say that every copy you buy, £1 goes to the IRC. But I just want to end by saying a little bit about why I think this issue has wider relevance than simply being a policy problem out there on its own that a few charities work at. And it's the following argument, that actually the work of rescue is not just about rescuing refugees whose lives have been shattered by conflict and persecution. It's also about rescuing the values that for the last 70 years have defined what the West stood for in the international system. The reason that refugees have rights goes back to 1941, to a meeting of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in Newfoundland. It was 4 months before the US entered the war, and they issued something called the Atlantic Charter. And it wasn't a charter for how to win the war, it was a charter for what kind of peace would be built afterwards. And it's from the Atlantic Charter that we got the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it's from the UN Declaration on Human Rights that refugees have any rights at all. And what was recognized in those charters was that the hosting of refugees and the support for refugees was a global public good that needed to be organized and maintained with proper rights for refugees and proper responsibilities for the states concerned. 160, 170 countries are now signatories to that refugee convention. And what strikes me is that when we trash the rights of refugees, or when the rights of refugees are trashed, we're actually trashing our own history in the Western world. We're trashing our own strategic position, because although the UN Charter was signed by democracies and dictatorships, by capitalist countries and communist countries, they all signed up to the idea that individuals should have inalienable rights that would be defended by the international system. And by trashing the rights of refugees, we actually undermine the very position of Western countries in the international system. So as you think about the massive issues that you're all dealing with, about how you think about making globalization fairer, making globalization more secure, making globalization more sustainable, my argument is that if we can't do it for the most vulnerable people in the world, who are the innocent victims of other people's wars, then we're not going to be able to do it for the rest of us. And if I've learned one thing in my 4 years as an NGO leader, it's this: political crisis does lead to humanitarian crisis. But untended humanitarian crisis leads to political instability. And if you look at what's happened in Europe over the last 5 or 6 years, you can see the proof of that. Thank you very much indeed. And I think Adam is now gracefully going to come and, like a jazz duet, we're going to seamlessly walk into the next section.
Normally I'd be introducing you, but you're introducing me.
Sorry, I should.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be here. We're going to sit down in just a moment, and I will be returning. This, by the way, is the British edition of the book with an orange cover, and it will be available for purchase and a donation to the International Rescue Committee after our session here. Now, we're going to talk about those matters in a moment, but I do want to cut to the chase of contemporary politics. Brexit, should it be stopped?
Definitely. It's the biggest act of national self-harm that this country has ever done. Now, it can only be stopped, though, having been started by a decision of the people, it can only be stopped by a decision of the people. But I am truly worried about the fate of my own country on the back of this decision. Obviously, I live in New York, but I'm a British citizen, and I look at the economic, social, and political harm of this decision. And I would just make the following point about the last 24 hours, where people seem surprised by the chaos that has engulfed the government's negotiating strategy. The reason I think you shouldn't be surprised is not because I think the government are inherently incompetent, although they do quite a good advertisement for that. But the reason I think you shouldn't be surprised is that the problems that are being run into over the Irish border are not incidental to Brexit, they are integral to Brexit. Once you have a decision to leave the customs union, you run into these problems. And I really hope that Parliament does its job, because it's often said, well, the people decided, that's the end of the story. Democracy can't be allowed to die on the 23rd of June 2016. Parliament has a responsibility to scrutinize this deal, and I would argue, ultimately, to put the deal that is negotiated, not just the deal on the divorce, but the deal on the future, to a vote of the people.
Do you think there should have been a referendum? Is that the way to deal with these things?
No, I spent my 3 years as foreign minister, we had regular amendments put down to the Lisbon Treaty by the Conservatives arguing for a referendum. And I quoted back at them someone I don't often quote, Mrs. Thatcher, but she was quoting Clement Attlee, the 1945 Labour Prime Minister, who both of them said, referendums are for dictators and demagogues. And I'm afraid, I know what you're going to say next, but didn't New Labour start this referendum thing? I think that's a very legitimate point. I think we're a proud parliamentary democracy. I just had someone say to me in Germany yesterday, they said, look, we need you in Europe. You're the longest standing democracy in Europe. We need you part of us. We're just really sad about what's happened. And I regret that descent into referendumitis. I think that this referendum was spectacularly ill-cooked, but I don't think it's the right way to solve the problems in a representative democracy.
I mean, isn't the correct way for people who feel as you do to work to make it as successful a Brexit as possible, rather than to hope to turn it round in a 2-year period?
Well, I think you can do both. I think we want, I would say, if Brexit is going to happen, it should be a Brexit that leaves Britain as close as possible to the rest of Europe and as close as possible to the EU. But I also am entitled, I think, to say that when the reality of Brexit becomes clear, when the deal is actually done about what a future trading arrangements and other links are going to be, people should be able to have their say. I think you can argue for both. My own very, very sad view, or sad conclusion, is that there is no such thing as soft Brexit. There is slow Brexit, but there is not soft Brexit. The only Brexit on offer is a hard Brexit, not because continental Europeans want to rub our noses in it. I don't think they do particularly.
But, I mean, soft Brexit would generally be defined as staying on the same terms in terms of trade, the single market, the customs union, and therefore having the freedom of movement of people and standing by some of the European Court of Justice. I mean, that surely isn't on offer, isn't it?
That isn't or isn't?
Is on offer.
Well, it's far from clear that that's on offer. I mean, first of all, I would have favoured a negotiating strategy which started by the day after the referendum, the government saying, look, there's a safe harbour of the European Economic Area, and before we trigger Article 50, we're going to make absolutely clear where we're going to end up. Because I was in office when we brought through the Lisbon Treaty that had Article 50. And never in my wildest dreams did I think a country would trigger Article 50, set the clock ticking on departure, before it knew exactly where it wanted to end up. But that's the stupidity of what we've done. Now, what's happened in the interim is that there are plenty of Norwegians saying, well, hang on, it's not clear that you'd be welcome in the European Economic Area. There's all sorts of difficult issues that are associated with that. So my fear is that the politics of the Conservative Party make a soft Brexit impossible. So we're doomed to hard Brexit. Hard Brexit wasn't something that people voted for, and I think they deserve the chance to have a vote on it.
Relevant to what you've just been saying to us, how did you feel when in her first major party conference speech, the Prime Minister said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere?
Well, I really felt that she was wrong. I mean, that's the simplest way of putting it. That, because she was wrong in two senses. I think that you can stand up for universal human rights, if that's what would be the example of what a citizen of the world stands up for, while being patriotically British or German or Irish or anything, or French or anything else.
I mean, you are a citizen of the world, aren't you?
Well, no, I'm a citizen of Britain, actually. The world doesn't give you a passport. Britain gives me a passport. And so if it was meant to be a term of abuse, I think it was wrong. But I would also say, why demonize the fact that the world has become more interconnected, that people are living and working in different countries? That should be a great thing about the modern world. It doesn't. My favorite poem is a poem called Roots and Wings. And I don't believe that the wings that allow you to see and understand the world undermine your roots. If anything, the phrase, absence makes the heart grow fonder, shows that you don't lose your roots. And I don't think that, I felt it was a better soundbite than it was a philosophy.
But the problem is many people felt that they were getting poorer, and we know that in both the United States and in this country, incomes have not risen significantly for a decade at least, and they felt threatened that globalization meant that jobs were being exported and people were coming in from abroad to take what jobs and opportunities there were in this country. Yeah. What's the answer?
Well, the answer is to make globalization fairer, more equitable, more secure and more sustainable. And that's easier said than done, but that is far better than thinking that deglobalization is the right way forward. Look, the fact that trade adjustment has been far less invested than trade agreements is not a requirement of the global system, it's a political choice. The fact that the squeeze on middle-class wages has been going on, that inequality has reached these extraordinary levels. In the US, the average CEO is now paid 274 times that of the average worker in a company. That's not required by globalization. Now, there were some policy choices where we made a mistake. When we were in government, we should have had a transitional arrangement for the entry of the 8 European countries into the European Union's labor market after 2004. But those are political choices. I mean, to be even more provocative about it, the problem in the world today is not that international institutions are too strong, it's that they're too weak. The problem with the refugee crisis is not that Europe has too strong a degree of coordination, it has too little. The problem in energy policy in Europe is not that the European Union is too strong, it's too weak. And the problems that the UN has in peacekeeping and elsewhere are not that it's too strong, but it's too weak. Yeah. It's too weak for the phase of globalization that we have that we've undertaken.
Yeah, the government here, as we've talked about, and the government in the US are in the process of de-emphasizing their commitment to international organizations. I mean, who do you think is worse, the British government or the Trump administration?
Well, the Trump administration has made 3 or 4 decisions that I think are very dangerous, really. I mean, some of them are about the nuclear deal with Iran. Some of them are about the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. But also, one more relevant to the world maybe of this audience, the decision to withdraw from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, has long-term consequences because politics abhors a vacuum. And the politics now of the Far East or the politics of Asia really, is now structured around China as a pole of economic organization. And I think that it's it's unbalancing for the world to have what I see as the global anchor, which is the US economy and politics, really being pulled out. There's a small example. On Friday, the US decided to withdraw from something called the UN Migration Compact. I mean, actually, the UN Migration Compact is a totally voluntary discussion forum, and they've withdrawn from it. And that is deglobalization, and that is dangerous in my view.
Do you see Donald Trump being there a long time?
Well, I see him being there certainly for another 3 years. And I think that, obviously my predictions are perfect. I mean, I got Brexit wrong, I got Trump wrong, and I got the British general election wrong. So you can trust everything I say.
You're not the only one.
Thank you. But I think he's there for the next 3 years. And obviously, it would be stupid to rule him out from being re-elected. He's coined, or he's cornered, a market in a politics of grievance that has a lot of sway.
I mean, his solution is build a wall, as we know.
Is what?
Build a wall. We've also got walls and fences going up in Eastern Europe. And of course, we have a wall in Israel-Palestine as well.
I mean, look, the second half of the 20th century was defined by the call, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And it would be a terrible irony if the first half of the 21st century is defined by the building of walls. Now,
but it is, isn't it?
Well, hang on, there's an interesting thing, though. I was in America at the time of the election, and then the wall thing started, and I said to the Democrats, I said, well, is there a wall at the moment? And they said, oh, yeah, we've got a wall. We've got 650 miles of wall at the moment. There just isn't a wall along the Rio Grande, because you obviously can't build a wall in the middle of the river. And that argument, I think, they got maneuvered out of position. I think the European issue is slightly different. It's completely right that citizens expect nations and groups of nations to track who comes in and who goes out, and preferably also who's rejected for admission. That is what Europe failed to have. It's only now, it does now have something called the entry-exit system. And I think that the call, quote-unquote, control our borders, manage our borders, is a perfectly legitimate thing to say, to manage the borders. And I think the European situation has been exacerbated by the fact that in 2013 and 2014, the refugee crisis was beginning to rage, but the whole of European attention was on the Russia invasion of Ukraine and on the Euro crisis. And so Europe is now playing catch-up. It's doing the right things, but it's still having to deal with an enormous backlog.
I mean, why are you so optimistic about continental Europe? As you say, you've got extremist governments in Hungary and Poland. You've got the French people rejecting the two mainstream parties in the election of Macron. You've got the Germans unable to form a government. You've got Italy paralyzed. I mean, why are you so optimistic?
Yeah, nice to be back. Look, I'm optimistic for...
I didn't even mention Spain either.
For two reasons, really. One is I think that the European economy is now got a serious prospect of getting to 2% growth, which is not massive, but is in a completely different space than 1% growth. So I think that the economic change is real. And secondly, and more importantly, notwithstanding the problems in Germany with forming a government, I actually think that there will be a renewal of the Franco-German motor. I do think that the French people chose
But that's because Britain isn't going to be there.
They chose hope, fundamentally. Well, I think, actually, I mean, Europe will be stronger with Britain in it. I feel that very strongly. But we're not going to be in it. And I think that the sense of... This is something that really struck me in Brussels a month ago. In the middle of the Euro crisis, Europeans I talked to were fearful but not sad about the Greek crisis. They were fearful of the consequences of the Greek crisis, but they weren't particularly sad about it. With Brexit, they're sad but not fearful. They're sad because they don't want us to leave, but they shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's your decision. They're not fearful that it's an existential threat to the European project. And actually, if anything, it's given a bit of momentum to it. Brexit and President Trump's opposition undoubtedly helped President Macron, or then President-elect Macron. And so I think that Mrs. Merkel sees it as her defining duty to cement Germany's position as a co-leader of the European Union with France. And I think that that will give the kind of impulse that Europe needs.
Now, what about you? Because I've never been at a public event with you where people haven't come up afterwards and say, why can't we have David Miliband as Prime Minister?
No, that's...
anyway, see, there's some here.
The absence makes the heart grow fonder.
All right. But where did it go wrong when you look back in terms of your political career?
Well, I can pinpoint that pretty accurately, really. I mean, there was a certain Saturday in September 2010.
That was the fact.
Well, look, I think that essentially what happened is that we came into government in '97. We had real momentum. After 2005, I think we gradually lost that momentum. And I talk about this a bit in the book. I think that our problem after 2007, after 2010, was that Labour spent too much time defining itself against its own past, rather than defining itself against the Tories, and more importantly, defining itself against the future of the country.
I mean, do you think...
And I feel that to the extent that I take my responsibility for that happening, and to that extent, that's the best.
I mean, do you think it was a mistake that you didn't overthrow Gordon Brown?
No, I'm not going to start saying that, because
You could have done.
Well, no, I don't think there wasn't the force or group of people to do that. There wasn't the support for that. And the financial crisis the government grappled with in 2008-9 in a serious and determined and effective way. So I'm not going to go back.
What about not becoming European Foreign Minister? Was that a mistake?
Well, then that's more difficult, isn't it? But let's not. You can't run your life by pressing the rewind button. You've got to do what you think is right at the time. I felt it was important to see through the time in government, to try and lead the party. It didn't work out. One of the things I learned about myself is that you should only ever want to do something if you really are committed to doing it. But you shouldn't do something if you're so worried about the prospect of failure that you wouldn't be able to live with yourself.
I mean,
and maybe that's hyper-rational, but that is part of who I am. And I think that this isn't a memoir that I've written, but I did want to try and address some of the aspects to it. And I think it was a failure of renewal of our politics. And in a way, centre-left parties are still paying for that.
This does relate to what you're saying about rescuing refugees. I mean, one thing you do think now quite clearly is that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake.
Definitely, definitely. I'm absolutely clear.
And when did you conclude that?
Well, pretty early. I mean, pretty early on, in that the war was won, but the peace was lost. And
so the war wasn't the bad thing. It was.
Well, no. Let me just say that. First of all, there are two strategic errors at the heart of the decision to go to war in Iraq. One was the fact that the war in Afghanistan hadn't been concluded. The second was that the Iranians were massively strengthened. But there's also a very important point, which is that in good faith, and I completely reject all the people who want to say Tony Blair lied about it. I think that's rubbish. I think that what was true is he made a judgment, above all, about the weapons of mass destruction. And I did too. And we were wrong about the fact that there were weapons of mass destruction there. But even if there's a wider point, there's a weapons of mass destruction point, but there's a wider strategic point, which is that the geopolitics of the region were upended in a very damaging way.
There's still this argument over what used to be called liberal interventionism, the use of force for what are seen to be beneficial humanitarian ends. Now, you're clearly in favor of intervention through the aid route. Is there still a case for the use of force to intervene in military terms?
Well, I'm happy to answer the question the way you've posed it, which is a short answer, yes, there is. I still believe in the responsibility to protect, but I also have to be very careful because I've got 1,200 staff working for me in Syria. I've got people in the middle of war zones in Yemen and in Libya. And so I think the generic question that you've posed, which is, does diplomacy have more chance of success if it's backed by force, even if that force isn't in the end used? The question is undoubtedly yes. And I mean, Frederick the Great once said that diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. And there's a danger that we end up with there are two dangers of imbalance in the global system at the moment. One is what I call, or what Richard Holbrooke actually called, the militarization of diplomacy. That every problem looks like it needs a military solution, and then you end up with a rush to war in a whole range of places. There are 4 world wars burning in the Middle East at the moment, and I was in Lebanon 4 weeks ago when the Prime Minister spirited himself away to Saudi Arabia, and people are very, very nervous there. The equal and opposite danger is that there is essentially impunity for people to commit war crimes against their own people. I mean, 8 of our hospitals in Syria were bombed last year by the Russians and by the Syrian government. And there's no sign that there's going to be any accountability for that. And I just say to people that is the idea that the Wild West can be exported around the world, either through danger number 1, which is that you militarize diplomacy, or danger number 2, that impunity becomes the scourge of the world as dictators think that they can do anything. I warn you, both of them have really severe consequences.
This morning I had the privilege of interviewing Ai Weiwei, and he's just made a film called Human Flow about the refugee crisis across the world. And that film concludes with a rather grim statement that he feels that the flow of people around the world, the displacement of people around the world is going to be the story, if you like, of the 21st century. And the things that they cite in particular are social media, the relatively low cost of transport, and also the impact of globalization. I mean, do you, at International Rescue, do you believe that this is going to be with us for decades and decades to come?
Yes, basically. I mean, I think that what we're living through is a trend and not a blip. And I say that because the drivers of the refugee crisis, this is separate from economic migration. There are 250 million people in the world on the move for economic reasons. But completely separate from that, just the 65 million who are displaced by conflict and persecution. The drivers of that change are long-term, not short-term. Weak and fragile states that don't have the political systems to reconcile different political, ethnic, religious points of view. South Sudan is an example of that. Secondly, the weakness and division of the international political system, of which the withdrawal of the West is an important element. I see that as a long-term trend. And thirdly, frankly, one's got to be careful how one treads into this area, but tumult, division of a really fundamental kind within Muslim-majority countries about fundamental questions about the meaning of Islam and its engagement in global politics, in its meaning for accountable government, its relevance for people. And it is striking that, to that third point, that we were founded to rescue people from Europe. Probably 40 to 45% of our work is now in Muslim-majority countries. And so those three trends, if you accept that those are three fundamental big issues that are driving the global crisis, you can see that none of them are going to be resolved in the short term. And there's a fourth one coming, obviously, which is the climate crisis. Because although climate, I shy away, I don't like the term climate refugee, because there are relatively few people who are going to be forced to cross a border simply because of a change in climate. And it's hard to say that it's not safe for them to go back to their own country, although it might not be safe for them to go back to their own community. There's no doubt in my mind that climate change, resource stress, is a multiplier of conflict, and is therefore a multiplier of the kind of people movements that we're seeing.
And the final question, what can we, the people in this room, what can we, should we do about these problems? Well,
I think that there are 3 or 4 things. One is I really think it's important that people use their voice in their communities, in their countries, in their politics, around their kitchen tables, to speak up for these most vulnerable of the world's people. Secondly, if you're an employer, in any country that's hosting refugees, not just Western countries, because there are people here from 30 countries, is give refugees a chance to work, because they will turn into productive and, if they're given citizenship, patriotic citizens. Thirdly, if your company has a CSR policy, ask yourself, are we delivering corporate social results? Not just corporate social responsibility, corporate social results. If you've got an advertising team, if you've got a strategy team, if you've got a legal team, we could use their time and brains and effort to help the work that my charity does or that others do. And then finally, to the point that I raised earlier, obviously, we are a $730 million organization. We've got 27,000 staff in 196 field sites. But we've grown by about, well, we were 4 years ago when I joined, we were only $430 million. But the other big change is that we've gone from being 10% privately funded to 20% privately funded. So we're now raising $160, $170 million a year from individuals, corporations, and foundations. And I told you I now had been in New York for 4 years, so please get your checkbooks out and make your contributions both individually and collectively for your company, because this is a crisis and that we're on the absolute front lines of, and the colleagues that I've got on the front line are doing absolutely amazing and heroic work, and I think you'd be very proud to be associated with it.
David Miliband, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.